For me, I think there's a more basic philosophical distinction that has to be made about what might be art. So, by definition, for me, the incorporation of other areas of the world besides the Euro-American center means redefining what art is. And so that's the crucial distinction. Which redefinitions of art do we find in Japan, or which redefinitions of art are available in Bulgaria, which redefinitions of art are available in Iran? And by opening up the door as widely as possible, I believe that we will come to potentially a redefinition of art that is akin to the redefinition of art in my personal experience. There's a redefinition of art that took place within Russia and the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, in which virtually all of the art that was displayed went to storage. And virtually all of the art that was seen by no one became the art that goes in museums. So the question for me is not one of incorporation, but disincorporation. Most of the art produced in the 20th century was more consonant with socialist realism than it was with the material that's in MoMA. That's a basic problem that we've just chosen not to think about. Yeah, the biggest thing for me is Boris Groys should be understood as an artist. In these contexts, that as I've noticed them in Japan, in particular, Brazil, Soviet Union are the places that I'm vaguely familiar. Seems as if the 1970s, the process of the 1970s, starting in the 60s, discursive practices assume a role that could almost be described as art itself. And I think that will be an immense challenge to curators. How do we understand a discursive practice? I'm hardcore. I would say Rosalind Krauss is functionally an artist as well. That is, redefining Jackson Pollock is a way of making a new Jackson Pollock. We just haven't, I think, conceptually gotten there yet. What would it mean to have a museum that was dedicated to discursive practices? And this is one of the reasons why I tend to think Tina Segal is probably the most important artist today, because he seemed to have gotten at the immateriality of this through a backdoor different way. But having an entirely empty museum would seem to me would move us closer to engaging with the truly vital arts in the Soviet Union in the 1970s, 1980s, something like that. Obviously, the absence of consumerism and a sort of a deficit of ecstasy in everyday life would be the crucial mechanisms for artistic production, it would seem to me, in Eastern Europe. It varies very much from locale to locale. I find the conflation of Eastern Europe is almost, I was going to say useless. It's close for one basic reason. The Soviet Union was dedicated to a universalist ideology that had incredible difficulties with any form of nationalism. This is not true in the national cultures that you have. Yugoslavia would be an exception, and East Germany would be, those would be two crucial problematic zones within even that paradigm. But that's not true throughout most of those. So there was a sort of Volkish national culture as one option, and a modernizing, more abstract language as another. The Soviet Union doesn't have this. What it does have for me in the 1950s and the 1960s, it has an inheritance of a watered-down modernism from the early part of the century that was generally not understood in the West. So a second-tier, third-tier modernism that was broadly realistic, broadly representational, that is, let's strike realistic, broadly representational rather than abstract, but not particularly surrealist. So you almost go from 1912 to 1955. For most of the artists I studied. They skip over surrealism, they skip over Dada, they skip over most of the constructivist moment, all of this, and they really are starting up again where Braque and Picasso are sort of leaving analytical cubism. And that's the genealogy that you really deal with, are sort of these second-tier, third-tier cubist practices, or Derain, something like that is where you're at. That's what takes you forward to the 50s. I don't think that's been described very well. The reason I don't think it's very useful is because you have societies that are dedicated to ideology that's fundamentally universalist. So the United States would be one. Has very, from my point of view, has a great deal of difficulty articulating a nationalist narrative that is also connected to any sort of ethnic or racial narrative. Most countries, that is not true around the globe, from my point of view. We already see this today. We see so many artists when we have to come up with the tombstone to describe the artist's nationality. It's just a jumble of facts that really tell you. For example, Kabakov is a Ukrainian artist. He's an American artist. Clearly, he's an American citizen. Does he identify in any way as a Ukrainian artist? No. I would say technological determinism comes much. Is much more relevant as a marker. You can almost map it. If a society has contact with photography, once it has contact with film, once it has contact with television, the internet, you'll see drastic similarities arise globally in various different places. So I would argue that the Eastern European nations are most similar circa 1987 by their engagement with technology rather than ideology. You really would, I think, explain a great deal more about the character of the Soviet Union by focusing on the ways that people lived their everyday lives. Which shows were on TV? What did a magazine look like? What did the store shelves look like? When you walked outside, what did the streets look like? That tells you more than reams of information that you could read about political philosophy, etc. And it's very easily accessible, at least in a very superficial, but still, it's easily accessible. You can show people a few minutes of walking around Moscow in 1970, and you immediately get a sense, oh, that's what that's like.